I'm David Pinsoff,
I'm David Pietrzewski.
and this is Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast, actual evolutionary psychology.
By actual evolutionary psychologists.
Today we have a really impressive and wonderful guest, Sarah Mathew. She is a professor at the School of Evolution and Social Change at Arizona State University.
Yeah,
Um,
we
this
talked
was,
about that it's a really cool interdisciplinary institution. But even more
yes.
interesting, this was a riveting episode, David. I
Oh,
don't.
yeah. This was honestly one of my favorites. So, yeah, we start out talking about interdisciplinarity and research and how it gets done. And then we get into Sarah's amazing work and her pioneering perspective on cultural evolution and the cultural evolution of warfare. We get into so many fascinating topics
Yeah,
like
we get into
reciprocity. Yeah.
killing,
Oh, yeah.
PTSD, and just talking about with her work with the Turkana, where she's really with folks really doing violence, and why that exists, but then also people not people who are you're not violent towards, and why those rules persist, and the psychology of war and the consequences of killing. Just incredible.
Yeah, really wonderful stuff. And we get into cooperation, self-interest, and just the level of detail that you get just being, up close and personal with a group where
Mm,
literally half the men are dying in warfare, and
yeah.
just familiarizing yourself with the cultural context there and just learning from her was just it was so fascinating. Really recommend listening through to the end for this episode. It's a banger.
Yeah, enjoy. Here we go. So today I'm really excited to have Sarah Mathew on the podcast. Sarah is at ASU in the anthropology department. And Sarah, how long have you been at the in the anthropology department at ASU now?
So since 2013, but I will have to correct you on the anthropology
Ah,
department because we are actually in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change and the Institute of Human Origins, and both of those programs are actually an interdisciplinary research group. It includes anthropologists, but it also includes sociologists, psychology, even applied math people. So we are a interdisciplinary group.
that is a wonderful correction. And I remember looking at ASU, and was that something that Rob Boyd and Joan Silk started or helped found, or?
So the reorganization of ASU into these interdisciplinary schools started with President Michael Crow. So
Hmm.
when he took over as president of ASU, there was a huge reorganization into becoming a transdisciplinary school, like at its core, not like, you have Department of Anthropologies
Yeah.
and then you make them talk together. No, it was just like break down all of
Um,
old departments and disciplines and put like new groups of people together. So we have the School of Sustainability, we have the School of Global Futures, School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and School of Family Dynamics, School of Transporter Studies, and these are the main kind of academic communities here at
that's
ASU.
been
It's a very
that's been
special place.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So is it that literally like the physical building, the people that you see in the hall, the people that you're like running into or having meetings with, they're all in these different disciplines.
Yeah, so our faculty meetings, for instance, are, all of the School of Human Evolution and Social Change faculty, and there's about
Hmm.
60 or 70 of us, so it's pretty big. But yeah, we don't have a sub-community of anthropologists within that. We all have
Right.
different programs. There's different kinds of, collaborations within and across these schools. But yeah, we're sitting around with people who have bought into the idea of transdisciplinarity.
That
And,
sounds
and
fantastic. Yeah.
do you find that it works, or are the barriers kind of harder than you would like them to be? Because I often, sometimes talking with people with different disciplines, you have different vocabularies, different methodologies. It's hard to meet in the middle. It's hard to have collaborations. They have different expectations about, publishing in different journals. I remember, I think it was Jerry Fodor who said that the best interdisciplinary work is done within one's own skull. Uh, the idea there being like it's good to avail yourself of different perspectives and different disciplines, but as soon as you have to sort of work things out with someone in a different community, things get kind of difficult. So, do you buy the Fodorian perspective that it's better to happen within one's skull, or are you more of an optimist that it really can happen and those bridges really can be made?
Yeah, I think I'm an optimist, but I also do agree that actually there's a lot of integration that does eventually need to happen within one single individual, but that's aided a lot by who we're talking to, the
Hmm.
kinds of vocabulary we're exposed to, the kinds of opinions we're exposed to. So I think that it has actually worked out pretty well. It is true that, you will tend to, gravitate more towards the people that are talking the same things that you're talking, etc. But I also have just noticed that there's just a lot more freedom because of this institutional structure to actually just do things that you want to do and not be constrained by what your disciplinary expectations are. So,
Mm,
for people coming up for promotion and tenure, it's okay that you got your PhD in anthropology, but you are not publishing in current anthropology. You're
right.
publishing in sustainability journals or conservation journals or engineering journals or AI journals. Like it just simply doesn't matter. Like there isn't a rigid expectation, and that really opens up and allows people to
Mm,
kind of explore things that they might have wanted to explore in a different setup, but are not able to. And that also means that the way people are evaluated within the university is very different, and it's very individualized, and people kind of make it's a lot more upon the individual to make their case of who they are, how they're kind of bringing things together and stuff like that, rather than an exogenously imposed uh, kind of set requirements type of system. So yeah, I think that institutionally providing that freedom is very useful, because otherwise people might be interested but are constrained by these factors.
yeah, I
Hmm.
love
Is
that.
there is the
Oh, sorry, David, go
yeah.
ahead.
I was just curious about if there was any particular project that you were able to get off the ground and get excited about because of the absence of these constraints. Like, is there anything that you felt liberated to pursue in this environment that you might have not otherwise pursue?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll start with kind of a little bit more of a standard kind of collaboration, which maybe many evolutionary anthropologists do engage in. But, one of the directions that I took my work in um, was to try to incorporate an understanding also of the genetic population structures in Turkana,
Mm,
because I was doing some work on how does culture shape, groups, and what's the population structure of cultural variation. But then that kind of begs the question, how is that different from the population structure of genetic variation? And that's a very genetics question, but it needs to kind of be integrated with cultural evolutionary approach too. So for that, I've been working with geneticists. So with Anne Stone, who's a geneticist from the anthropology side, but Melissa Wilson, who's bioinformatics, genomics person who is very much in the School of Life Sciences and not at all connected with anthropology. And that kind of was a bringing together of, two worlds in some ways, and very different expectations about also how to work, how to do genetics research in small scale societies, which, when I have a collaborator here at ASU who's from the School of Life Sciences, I also know that, they are free to like kind of step into the anthropological space and do things the way anthropologists do. So working genetics work in small scale societies goes much slower. There's a lot more need to like, dialogue with the community, to like do different things, like not, make the data publicly accessible for anybody to like do work because the communities haven't consented to that. So it's like, it's a really different kind of beast for a genomics person to like work with an anthropologist working in a small scale society. But, because they are here, everybody's used to this idea that, you don't have to be constrained by the way your discipline does things. You can work with anthropologists, you can slow down, you can say no to some things that might be expected in the genetics community, such as, putting up the your data publicly, etc. So so that's one example. Another is that I am working with a legal scholar now, and that project initially started with working on norms, and that's kind of close to like what I'm working. I'm used to, but it has kind of also drawn us into thinking about how to build normativity into AI systems, because she's somebody who works as a legal scholar. She's worked on like how legal institutions need to change in order to accommodate new technology, and AI is like a big technology. So this is Gillian Hadfield, who's at Johns Hopkins University. And so now, just about a couple months ago, we organized a workshop here at ASU in which we had cultural evolution folks, so very anthropology and psych people, but together with people from Google DeepMind and that people who are working on AI, and like I just feel that wherever your research kind of takes you, wherever your collaborations take you, and whatever feels interesting, that's the next step. Another project that I'm doing is working with people who are in disease ecology. So, to study zoonosis, because one of the things that we learned when we were working as anthropologists in the Turkana is that, the Turkana eat meat that is, even when they find the animal dead, they will eat the meat. And so that in a public health kind of outlook kind of is considered a very risky type of meat consumption. Yet, in our observation, we're not seeing people get sick when they eat that. They eat meat of animals that are dying of certain diseases, like close to death from diseases and disease epidemics. Even I've eaten that meat when I'm there. Like we had the Rift Valley fever epidemic going around, like lots and lots of animals were dying. And so basically, like, just a couple hours before the animal's dead, somebody is, killing them and sharing that meat out. So yeah, that question basically was, well, maybe they have cultural knowledge of how to process this meat and how to make it safe to eat, and also to recognize when it can't be eaten, when it can be, and also what organs maybe to avoid, who should avoid these things, like, maybe pregnant women. So we don't know that, but we're going to like delve into that cultural knowledge landscape. But we also want to look at the physiological adaptations that maybe the Turkana have, like either immune or like, genetic adaptations they have for like, this high pathogen load meat. And so that requires working with, again, like people who are interested in public health, disease ecology, zoonosis, and maybe genetics, immunologists. So it's, I feel like my work has kind of just progressed in a way where I have certain questions that I'm really interested in and that keep me, on one path, but then that path also opens up a lot of like questions that you just stumble upon and collaborations that you stumble upon. And wherever those lead, I feel free to just, go and be supported in every way by the institution and my department.
Yeah.
etc.
I love that. And one of the throughputs that, as I think about your work, is, and I don't know how much we've talked about this explicitly, is as I think the term how you put it, which is sort of group structured cultural selection. And that's even a throughput of what we talked about already, which is like ASU has a different institutional selective regime.
Mhm.
And so you're free to do things differently. But then, even in the Turkana example, there might be cultural technology for people who may not know what that idea is. Can you sort of explain that? And then maybe, I don't know if maybe the Turkana example, I mean, it's sort of simple, but just even, what the idea is refracted through that example of, how do why do they know how to deal with meat that in a way that other places might not?
Mhm. So yeah, I guess your question kind of touches on two things that I think are maybe useful to kind of separate a little bit. So one is the question of just culture and cultural learning, social learning that produces cultural knowledge that gets transmitted in humans. And there's a large number of people who are trying to understand that in the evolutionary human sciences. And I think that that is, as do many people, think that that is a very important part of like how humans became very different from other organisms, our extreme reliance on culturally transmitted information, social learning, and that leads to um, variation between groups that might be genetically very similar, but have learned from different people, have had different role models in their past, and have been exposed to different environmental conditions in the past that have shaped the knowledge and the norms and the institutions, and then that gets transmitted, etc. So in the Turkana case, for example, yes, why do they know how to look at a day-old dead animal and figure out whether they can eat it or not? Whereas, if we do, we will just say, no, that's not, right? We're both um, uh, kind of on the face of it, should maybe be able to like reason about those things similarly, but the Turkana are able to reason about it in a very different way because of that of the accumulation of knowledge that has come from being pastoralists for perhaps the last 5,000 years. So one of the characteristics of pastoralists is that a lot of people think pastoralists eat a lot of meat, but the truth is that pastoralists um, are really good about not killing animals for meat. They
Mm,
use, especially like East African pastoralists, they use a lot of their animals mostly for milk. And milk is a huge form of their sustenance. They also consume the blood from the animals, but milk is a big sustenance. And they're really, really reluctant to kill an animal, a healthy animal, for meat. They would do that for ceremonies. They do that, like for marriage, where you have to kind of kill a bull, etc. They'll do that for like healing, like somebody's sick, and there's like a healing practice that says, kill this kind of animal. But just for food, it's kind of something that is done with a lot of intention and thought and very cautiously, because you don't want to kill a healthy animal. But when an animal is dying, when there's an epidemic going around, an animal's dying, then they kind of make use of the meat very the same. They don't want to waste any part of
right.
that animal if they don't have to. They also sometimes find animals who've been killed. So when I was there once, there was a camel that was found just maybe a couple kilometers outside of the settlement that I was staying in, where my campsite is based. And it looked like the camel was maybe killed by a snake bite, because there are like some very, very poisonous snakes in the area, something that can kill a camel.
Oh,
Um, and so the camel was found dead, um, but they didn't immediately kind of cut open the camel and start eating the meat. They had to find out, who the owner is, because the owner could have been. Camels wander quite a lot, so the owner might be somebody in like some other settlement, and so it took like maybe half a day to a day to like find um, the owner, and then tell the owner camel's dead, we're killing, and then the meat. Then in the evening we got um, bunch of camel meat at our camp and heard the backstory of it, and I didn't even think twice about not eating it, because everybody eats it. It's there is just no question that this is maybe something that's been sitting in the heat for too long. So they just know these things because they've had to deal with these challenges in the past. That's part of the cultural and subsistence package that they rely on. And it's a way of living that has allowed them to survive in habitats that, you and I would not be able to survive in without that knowledge, like a very arid environment where agriculture, the crop cultivation is very difficult, except along like the riverbeds and stuff. And so that is how they have potentially a lot of knowledge that allows them to do that. And then I think your other question related to the group structured cultural selection, which I think is a different question, but I'm going to let you interject before I go into that phase, because I'll.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. I actually have nothing to interject other than just I think it's so powerful that like the transmission of knowledge is so important. I think about like the Rob and Joan example of what was it that there was like, colonial traveler or something like traveling somewhere and they basically starved to death or almost starved to death. Do you know that? Is that
Yes, that is in their used to be in their intro to anthro class at UCLA, and here too, and also their textbook. But I believe so. Yeah, that is basically the thought experiment of, if you think that humans all have a capacity, a psychological disposition, motivations, reasoning capabilities, cognitive skills, etc., that allow them to that are sufficient for them to extract a living out of all the environments that humans currently live in. Then your prediction is that, well, yeah, like you and I could go to where the Inuit are living, or could go into the Sonoran Desert, into the Australian desert, into the rainforest, and be able to figure it out and make a living. Yet, if you just think about it, I think I wouldn't be able to. What do you think? Would you?
I think there would be a really good movie about me on the knife's edge of death,
Yeah.
and there's a very likely chance that I wouldn't make it. Yes.
Would it be comedy or horror?
There would be moments where, it would be sort of like what is the Tom Hanks movie with the
Castaway?
volleyball? Castaway,
Yeah.
where there's some comedy in there, like the
Uh-huh.
macabre, yeah, per the theory of humor, where you make a big mistake, but it's kind of funny because it's really bad, high cost
Yeah.
mistakes. No,
Yeah.
totally. No, I mean, for sure. Yeah.
So I guess mostly the finale will at least be a tragedy.
For sure. Yeah, no, for sure. We know how this ends for sure. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, but then, sometimes I actually ask this to students when I'm teaching the intro classes, and some of them actually think they can. Like, an 18, 19, 20-year-old is filled with like confidence. They've gone
Yeah.
camping, they've like spent a few nights out, and they feel like in Arizona, we also have like survivalist community where like, there are
Mm,
people who are like very into being able to live off the land, and
yeah.
who are making bows and arrows, hunting, etc. So you'll have a couple of people say that they think they can survive much longer than I actually think they can. Um,
Yeah.
so they haven't yet been humbled by the experiences of life yet. But that's kind of why this thought experiment, this historical experiment, is a good illustration of that, because when we reflect on ourselves, we might be very confident of our capabilities, but we know that there were people, explorers, who were actually had a lot of information, just not the local information, but outside information, had a lot of technology, but not the local technology, but outside technology. And we, some of the technology was really fancy, right? Like that the explorers had. They came from some of the most powerful and technologically developed countries of the time. And yet there's just one thing they lacked. They lacked the knowledge that somebody who grew up there had. And they lacked the kind of much simpler tools and technology that people who lived there had. And, many of them died. Um, it did have that tragic finale part. So it is really, I think, a very important aspect of humans. But that said, I as somebody who's really into taking these cultural aspects seriously, I also think that there are kind of, then universal psychological predispositions people have that make it possible for them to acquire this information. So the evolved psychology for social learning is really, really important. And without that, we wouldn't be able to get the relevant information, be able to prioritize what information we should be copying, know when to not copy, know when to innovate and ignore, know when to be a contrarian, those kinds of things. So the evolved psychology is very important. And that brings me to an experiment that I always present to my undergrad students, which Dave, you feature in.
Oh my goodness.
As a star actor there.
Okay.
Do you know what I'm talking
I think I
about?
have an idea. Yes, exactly.
Yes, this is the prepared learning experiment that Annie Wirtz and you had. You were, as I said, a star.
I was an actor. I was a beautiful
You were
face.
an actor.
That was it. Annie was the brains. Yeah. It was just I was a prop.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's a really excellent example of how you can have, there's a lot of structure in the psychology and there's a lot of preparation for being able to hone in on the kinds of things that we do need to socially learn. I really think of that experiment as one of the best illustrations of that complexity, where it's not like you have um, it's not like you come with just a ready psychology to learn XYZ, but rather you come with a psychology that's prepared to learn that you should learn socially, right?
Right. Right.
So that I think is maybe this area where evolutionary psychology has taken a slightly different take on this than maybe people in human behavior ecology, cultural evolution, etc., where I think early on there was more of a resistance to how important culture was.
Right.
But then, that in some ways, evolutionary psychologists were pushing back against an older model of humans
Right.
in which there was no kind of preparation that the brain needed, and it was just this big container that could be filled with anything. But I think that I'm hoping that we're kind of in a space now where we can be doing more of the kind of sophisticated experiments that you start in, and really kind of parse out what is the evolved psychology and where is it much more open to taking in cultural information, and where is it more kind of canalized into learning certain things a little bit more rigidly. And how does that structure come about? That's another question that I think is open. And I feel like a lot of my early exposure to to these ideas of modularity and prepared learning, came from UCSB, from like John and Leda's work, and from Clark Barrett and Dan Fessler. And so that's kind of how I've been thinking about a lot of things. But I've also, as I've started working now with people in AI and cognitive science, I see a perspective where they are talking about how you can get these, like for instance, how neural networks are learning, etc. It seems like there is a lot about the brain that we don't understand, and it's possible that you can get structure in the brain with very few priors early on, but with
Mm,
more of what you're exposed to early can kind of like create those hierarchical
yeah.
structures, or to what extent do you need a lot more richness in that hierarchy to like already function.
Right.
And it actually seems interesting to me that maybe like artificial intelligence research can give us a little bit of insight into what is possible here, because it seemed like for long it was a discussion between cognitive science, evolutionary psychology folks that still were limited in their methods because you can't probe the brain in some of the same ways that you can kind of design a brain like what the AI people are doing.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think like computer science and AI, and Annie Wertz and I just we're working on a chapter about AI and EvPsych. I think that's a really wonderful thing. And I think if you read some of the early AI work and even some of the later stuff by like Marvin Minsky, it's very much a person who's sort of a fellow traveler in the sense of there's problems in the world, real world problems, right? Like focusing on real world problems, even if even if it's not maybe evolutionarily relevant problems, but still real world problems, and analyzing them, doing a task analysis, and saying what machinery do you need.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
my take on just to say like my take on sort of how much structure you need, I think it's answering sort of two separate questions. Like I think the old school quote unquote sort of EvPsych modularity stuff was sort of a discussion of what's the sort of like full content architecture in the mind that's actually making doing the day-to-day stuff possible. And I think a slightly separate question is sort of how do you build that with the minimal genetic and developmental content?
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think a lot of the machine learning and a lot of that stuff that's sort of asking how can we build the representations, it's a slightly different question, which is sort of what's the minimal way, given that there's structure in the environment, and this is how development works already. It's sort of natural selection itself faces this challenge of how do I store the minimal amount of information, or even better yet, sort of like chemistry in a developmental little packet such that it reliably interacts with the regularities in the environment to produce a whole body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and it's sort of the what's the minimal packet of contingencies that's necessary. And I think that's true for even the mind too. So I do think there's probably a lot of reinforcement learning or machine learning, a lot of the principles that we're learning about in AI or computer
Mm-hmm.
science,
Mm-hmm.
they're answering the question of what's the minimal structure required
Mm-hmm.
to sort of within a particular domain to extract a much ripper representation that isn't coded sort of by hand, or in this case maybe in the genes, right? Or it so it sort of allows the environment to structure the thing, and then the thing gets represented. So I think I kind of view it as it's actually complementary, and it's actually kind of asking two different questions. It's sort of the
Mm-hmm.
old school stuff was sort of what is that final end
Yeah,
state,
yeah,
and then this stuff is sort of how do you get there on a minimal perspective. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, that is a useful distinction for me to also get in my mind, because I think early on when I was kind of absorbing the EdPsych view of modularity and stuff, I think I kind of just lumped those two things together more like, yeah, if you um, assuming that if you have a rich structure that emerges early on, that there has to be more content that is programmed into the genetic machinery for it. But
Hmm.
I think you've separated it.
So it's an interesting point, Dave. I mean, is the distinction between the phenotype or the developmental phenotype and the way that the developmental
Yeah.
phenotype gets created?
Yeah, exactly.
And that
Yeah.
yeah, and so there are different the phenotype could be highly modular,
Yeah,
and yet the way that that
completely.
modular phenotype gets produced and interacts with the environment
Yeah.
could be very minimalistic in terms of genetic content.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
actually think a lot of, honestly, like, I have a foot in developmental psychology too. It's not my only thing, obviously, but like, and I actually, honestly, I read a lot of stuff between sort of what the quote unquote nativists and sort of empiricists in developmental psychology. And I actually think, honestly, it's the same thing where like, I think they're both right. And they're just sort of they're kind of talking past each other because they're talking about the process versus the outcome in a lot of cases.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess that was a little bit of tangent to what I'd started off with, which
Mm,
is, I guess, the how the Turkana are getting their cultural information. But then you'd also asked me about group structured cultural selection
yeah.
processes, and I think this is actually a space where I have. It's actually what drew me into the field of cultural evolution was because when I was doing my undergrad in ecology and evolutionary biology, that was as an undergrad was the first time I was actually like really getting introduced to evolutionary biology. But uh, I just kind of really fell in love with the idea that you can explain so much about the world through this framework, and the idea of like cooperation kind of stood out as something that is just, counterintuitive, but still can be explained. And so it's very, very interesting and intriguing in that way that it's just kind of a little bit not fully within the what you would expect, but then there are like these narrow pathways by which you can get it. And so I was, super interested in like sociality and ants and stuff like that. But being in a biology department, I realized like, there's just a lot of uh, potential here to think about humans, but nobody seems to want to do it. Like, it's about evolutionary biology departments were still very focused on drawing the line at, we can explain a lot up to like chimps, and then humans are just crazy
Yeah.
um, and weird, and we don't know what's going on. But that's when, towards the tail end, I was really interested in the cooperation question, and I read Robin Peet's 1985 book, Culture and the Evolutionary Process. And, this idea of culture allowing for a pathway by which you can get selective processes that are otherwise unavailable to genetic populations and genetic systems was, really very uh, intriguing, because I always felt like, when you think about human cooperation, it stands out in so many regards. It's not just that the scale of cooperation is large. That's a lot of the times what we focus on, that, oh, we cooperate in large groups in transient interactions with strangers. So that is spectacular. We do that, and that's a big thing. But there are other things, such as that scale seems to not be constrained by the number of people, right? Like it has changed from something that might be like 50, 60, 100 people
Mhm.
to something that can scale up to like thousands and potentially millions of people. So the fact that that scale is something that can be moved so like quickly is very unusual in the animal kingdom, right? Like we
Mm.
usually have a lot more constant selection produces a constant kind of social scale at which the cooperation is happening through these other mechanisms. The other thing that I've really tried to emphasize more recently is that, small scale cooperation in humans is also really different from small scale cooperation in other animals.
Mm.
So we cooperate way more with kin. We cooperate way more in reciprocal interactions than other animals that have many of these pathways of, kin-based kin selection reciprocity available to them. So if you think about it, animals that live in stable social groups have a lot of opportunity for repeated interactions. And, there can be, I am of the view that the benefits of cooperation are potentially there in a lot of different ecologies, like there's turn taking, there's possibility for food sharing, for collective childcare, for group defense, for collective predation, etc. So, but you are not getting the kind of intense reciprocal cooperation that actually traverses reciprocity theory predicts, which is, like WB greater than C is the condition for reciprocity to evolve. And like that means if you see somebody if you're expected to see somebody more than 2 times, you should be cooperating like your full siblings. But there's so much of that cooperation is just absent. We're not seeing it. We're instead evaluating whether reciprocity theory is supported by saying, okay, conditioned on the fact that we're seeing cooperation, do we see it happening in a way that is balanced and suggests that there's some kind of contingency going on? That's how we are evaluating the theory empirically. But we're not addressing one big problem, which is that, by conditioning it on cooperation that's already happening, we're not evaluating all those cases where cooperation is not happening when it should be, according to the theory. But in humans, we engage in just an intense amount of reciprocal cooperation. And like we do treat friends in ways that are comparable to how we treat kin. And even among within families, there are people that we will share a lot more with because they're sharing back with us. And there are family members will ignore. So, and just stepping into like the Turkana land again, people have friends that, like people are still walking many kilometers to go places. They don't have vehicles, but sometimes you'll meet somebody and they're traveling from like a place that's like 20, 30 kilometers away. And you ask them like, where are you going? They stop by like our camp. And they're like, oh, I'm going to say hi to my friend. He's like, another 30, 40 kilometers down that way. So like somebody is just walking, like 3 days or so. And his claim is he's going to say hi to his friend. Now he's going to say more than hi to his friend. He's going to say hi to his friend. His friend is going to kill a goat for him. He's going to stay there a couple of days and then potentially come back. Right. But it's like this level of investment in maintaining close friends in places that are far and wide and that you can then trust your animals with, to like, kind of hedge your bets, spread your risk, to call when you're going on a raid. So, when people are going on raids, sometimes they say, so I'm planning to go, and I sent this person all the way to that settlement to tell, so that he can go find my friend and tell my friend that I'm going. I'd like him to come and to meet me, here. So the friendship, and even on the raids, they stay together with their friends. They're not staying with their family. They're not supposed to stay with their fathers and older siblings because they're supposed to stay with their age mates, which means that they're, together with their friends. So that is extremely unusual in humans, that we are also cooperating much more intensively in small scale interactions, which technically, theoretically should be supported for a lot of other species too. And this is, I think the other puzzle is, or the other kind of unusual aspect is that we are also able to cooperate to a huge extent while still being fundamentally fairly selfish, I would say. Like, as somebody who studies prosociality and cooperative behavior, I will say that we are a fairly self-interested species. So we've managed to solve the problem of cooperation without having to commit to being purely pro-social, whereas ants, and they're so pro-social that they're just becoming obligately sterile. And so it's just this very kind of contradictory thing where, like, we can collaborate to, like, send people up to the moon to manage something like the International Space Station. Yet on a day-to-day basis, a lot of what we're doing is still going to be best predicted by what's in our interest. I mean, there is a little bit of, like, a real pro-social psychology there, but by and large, if an alien were to land here and try to predict, you know, uh, something about, for instance, economic models work really well, actually, like, prices go up, of wages go up, we can make certain predictions about how people will respond to those incentives. And people do respond to those incentives to a large extent in those ways. So yeah, how do we get so much cooperation while still, like, not having a psychology that is truly actually having that level of pro-sociality, right? So that's one question. Another question, I think, feature is that we, unlike a lot of cooperative breeders, so if you look at meerkats, if you look at cooperative breeding primates, etc., they have much more of a hierarchy in their cooperation. So there's somebody that's amassing the surplus of cooperation, which is the breeding female, and the others are kind of, getting the short end of the stick kind of thing. And humans, we do have that too. We do have hierarchies that have emerged in the course of cultural evolution. We have status differences, wealth differences, and all that stuff. But it does seem that this idea of fairness, of equity and egalitarianism is one of the important pathways by which humans have achieved large-scale cooperation. That's very different from how it's been achieved in eusocial insects and multicellular organisms. Only the sex cells, the gametes, are getting to really reproduce. Everything else is supporting it. So you don't really have a very good example of this kind of large-scale cooperation that is still built somewhat on the idea that everybody needs to get something, that there's ideas about equity, fairness, and it doesn't always work, but when it doesn't work, eventually, like, people get upset and they try to break down those systems and don't go along with those things. So we're intensively cooperative, but we're also so different from other organisms in many aspects of our cooperation at every scale. And so I think that when you have a situation like this, it feels like, well, something really is fundamentally very different about the conditions that are amenable to cooperation in humans compared to other animals. It can't be sometimes I see people saying, well, mobility solves cooperative dilemmas, but then I'm like, well, zebras can move, right? So, like, we need an explanation that really can encompass the fact that humans have just a ton of ways of cooperating that other organisms don't have. And the explanation should then account for the lack of cooperation in other species. It shouldn't just account for cooperation in humans, but then if that mechanism is seen somewhere else, we should expect that kind of cooperation. That's, I think, a type of theoretical precision that we need to be bringing to the table. And so the idea of culture, I think, is one of the big, like, it stands out because it is something that humans really very much differ from other organisms in, the kind of extreme reliance on imitation and culture, and the fact that that has led to some things like abilities for norms, transmission of norms, variation between populations in those norms and institutions that was previously, not available in genetically structured populations, like group level variation, all that stuff. So I've been really drawn to this idea that there are various things about culture that are what is very central to why our kind of cooperation is very different from what it looks in other animals. And the idea of cultural group selection has been one of the prominent ones. And because people don't like to use the word group selection loosely in these contexts, I've kind of tried to resort more to group structured cultural selection,
Right.
although the term hasn't caught on really.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not really good with coming up with terms that have to catch on, but
Right.
I'll continue trying to use.
Yeah. Not no, yeah, like weird is one of these, like, oh my gosh, like
Oh yeah,
that just
I know that just
yeah.
spread like wildfire.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, anyway, group structured cultural selection. It's a bit of a mouthful,
Yeah.
but I think that is one big way in which culture has changed something in humans. So, historically, we always people were drawn to this idea of genetic group selection because, yeah, if you can get groups, then you do, and those groups are very vary, then you do get the potential for selection to act on these entities. And if you can get selection at that level, you're going to get adaptations at that level, and those could be cooperative dispositions. But the reality proved those people wrong, because you just don't get that kind of population structure with genes. And we confirmed that in our study with the Turkana and the
Interesting.
neighboring pastoral groups. So when we did our genetics project, we sampled 4 different pastoral groups in the Northwest of Kenya, the Turkana, Samburu, Borana, and Rendille. And we sampled them at different social scales, so the scale of clans, sub-territories, and ethno-linguistic groups, so that we could see whether there's genetic variation at any of those scales. And the level of genetic variation is just really, really low, like it's less than 1%, like even between ethno-linguistic groups.
And just to clarify that we had just had Brett Boeheim on, and he talked about there's sort of the within group variation, between group variation. This is saying that the between group variation is very low compared to the within group.
Exactly. So it's not, and this is actually, I mean, I think that some geneticists would have said you don't even need to like do the study, like we know this. Don't waste money on this. And in fact, one geneticist that I spoke to before this project said, why are you doing that? I mean, I know the answer to that. And then I almost thought of not doing that project. But then I gave a talk somewhere where the person asking the question almost assumed that would be a thing. Because, like clans, for example, are like lineages of people who share a relative, and there's sometimes endogamy. And actually, the Turkana, even though they don't have rules against ethnic exogamy, most marriages are within ethnic groups. So most Turkana are marrying other Turkana because that's who they're seeing at dances and running into and things like that. So, but despite this high level of ethnic and endogamy, it's still, the border is kind of non-existent. The genetic border is non-existent, but there is a cultural border. And we get when you look at the cultural variation, you get things on the order of like 10 to 15%. 10, maybe the highest value we had was like 18 or 19% at the scale of ethno-linguistic groups. So there is something different in how cultural variation and genetic variation gets organized in populations, and cultural variation does seem more amenable to these kind of group-like structures. So that, I think, is a very important premise of group structured cultural selection. And I was very excited by the work that I'd done with Carla Handley with these 4 populations that kind of showed that. To me, it explains some things, not all things, but it explains some very important features about human cooperation, which is, why you get norms that make people want to cooperate at these really large scales, and why that scale can be so variable. So, because of what group structured cultural selection is saying is that, the scale of intergroup competition is going to be mostly along the scale of cultural variation. In this case, in Northwest Kenya, it's going to be mostly intergroup competition between ethno-linguistic groups, and selection is favoring norms and behaviors that then make people do things that benefit that cultural group. And that can explain, for instance, this really odd thing that, like the Turkana go on raids to get animals from other groups, but they have a norm that says, if you go and raid another Turkana, that's banditry, that's criminal. And even if you bring animals back to our community and share those animals, we don't like you. We don't want you. We're going to, discipline you. We're going to report you to those people that you stole the animals from. We're going to make you return those animals. So there's the strong norm that is telling people that there is this arbitrary group of people somewhere far down south, but who call themselves Turkana, that you need to not harm in order to bring something to your own community. But then there's another group of people there that it's okay to and as long as it's benefiting us. And in fact, it's not just okay to, in this particular cultural system, it's, praised and really encouraged, and people get a lot of status and glory from doing that. So you have to kind of explain that there's a particular scale at which that norm is operating, and it's providing benefits at this ethno-linguistic scale. It's creating social order at this scale of 1 million people, but it's breaking down at another scale, right? Like as soon as you step past that Turkana boundary, that norm is really would be useful, but it's not happening. It would be useful in the sense that, along the border, half of adult male mortality is due to warfare.
Wow.
And so many people on both sides are dying. And so if they could actually cooperate at this bigger scale in which, those other groups would be part of that in-group, everybody would be better off. But this is the classic cooperation problem. Even if we would both be better off if we both cooperated, if defection gives you even more, both sides are going to defect. And that's kind of what happens, is that unilaterally raiding another group has huge benefits. So let's say the Turkana say we won't raid the Toposa. Well, great time for the Toposa to go in and raid the Turkana, right? And vice versa. So you have the classic breakdown of cooperation at that level that is causing so much inefficiency, loss of lives, and everybody even knows they don't want this. It would be great if we didn't have to deal with this, but can't kind of overcome that problem. So I think cultural group selection is a very good candidate for being able to say why you can get the scale of cooperation to be something that's pretty big, but can also get bigger if the cultural group just expands. Like the Turkana have expanded from 250,000 people 30 years ago to 1 million people, but those norms have still persisted that say, now this new 1 million people still are ones that we can't harm. Right? Back in the day, it used to be 100,000 or 50,000 people, but now, as they've spread and been successful, they've displaced a lot of other groups from that area, and they've occupied this big area. They're about 1 million people strong, and the norm now just extends to this much larger group of people. But there is a constraint on that norm. That is that it's not able to go past a particular boundary. And if we were to think that humans are reasoning about this through their intelligence, through their recognition of the mutual benefits to cooperation, by sitting together and talking, by playing soccer games with each other and stuff like that, then, we wouldn't have this problem. They wouldn't be warring for like the last 30, 40 years, probably longer. So I've talked for long, so I'll stop talking.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
To interject.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, so many different threads that I would want to go down. Is there one that you want to go down most, Dave?
I was going to channel you because I think the last
Yeah.
thing we said was sort of, I mean, it sounds like that the Turkana example and the thing about why there's not sort of why aren't they cooperating, or why can't we end the violence with the other group? I mean, I feel like I'm doing channel David is just it's that the Turkana norm is sort of a coordination solution. It's a coordination technology of common knowledge that even if everybody on the border, for example, says, look, as an individual, I don't want to do this. Like you said, I can't be sure that the other people, even if like the one person I know doesn't want to do it, the other people, I don't know if they're not going to want to do it too, or they might just use it as the opportunity to like screw me over, right? Like that the example you used, there was a Saturday Night Live, I think it was quotes by Jack Handy, where I can imagine a society with no guns or no violence and no warfare, and I can imagine us sneaking up on them and really clobbering them. It's like it's exactly that that sentiment. So I feel like this Turkana thing of in Turkana, in scare quotes, sounds like it's just this thing of it's a packet of expectations and knowledge and rules that evolved psychology is sort of digested and used. And just to fill in the blank too, the cultural group selection idea is, as you said, we're sort of all selfish, or we all have this evolved psychology, and there's different sort of trial and error ways as groups of people to sort of stitch that together. And you can almost think about it as a metaphor of like building blocks. Like you try to build something out of a building block in one way or another way. And then at a certain point you can kind of smash them together and see which one does better than the other, right? And it could either be doing better because of conflict or doing better just by simple of like transmission or competition of just people are like, oh, that looks better than what I'm doing, right? Or it's, you kill the other group or whatever. But then the idea is that some of the ways of stitching together the evolved psychology work better than others, and this work better means gets extended or transmitted or extends. And if that's the idea, then it sounds like this Turkana packet way of dealing with an evolved psychology is doing relatively well, and it's spreading. And so the answer to the question of why it doesn't work kind of to the other group is just that what the Turkana is this sort of set of locked in coordination devices, that it's really hard to sort of create in a dynamic perspective. It's just, how do you get that dynamic going? That's sort of I'm sort of recapitulating what you've already said, just in different language, but that's what I wanted to interject. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very much the framework of how norms work, right? So it is about solving a particular problem of common knowledge. So I know if I'm a Turkana, I know that you expect me to do this, and
Right.
you know that I expect you to do this, and that uh, uh, it is the fact that you are embedded in this kind of shared knowledge that you can predict other people's response to your behaviors, that provides the deterrence and the motivation to do things a certain way, which also gets to my earlier point about why humans can be so cooperative while still being fundamentally selfish. It's because when we're following norms, we are being selfish. We are
Yeah.
not being pro-social. We are
Yeah.
simply doing what is in our interest,
Right.
that if I don't do this, then people will do this or think this of me and might not interact with me, etc. So I think the norms kind of help you explain, the normative pathway helps you explain how you can manage to get high levels of cooperation while still being fairly self-interested psychologically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think norms they are about solving this big coordination problem at either interpersonally or at a much wider scale. And I think the cultural group selection part helps you explain how you can get it at this really big scale, in which people can't just sit together and decide, oh, this is the scale at which
Yeah.
we're going to cooperate, and
Right.
that we've decided this is a useful scale. And so nobody has kind of gotten together to deliberate on that. It's just kind of growing bottom up. And so then that growing bottom up is coming through these cultural evolutionary processes, and the boundaries of that are being created by when these different normative systems are then clashing against each other, and one of them seems to do well, either because they align better with the evolved psychology. Maybe, like the norm is one that allows everybody to see some gain to what they're to going along with the system, and in another system, it's harder to see that. You feel more
Mm.
like you're being gypped, or something like that. So in that sense, it's what you've said, like which package is better at aligning with the psychology. But then there's also the other component, which is that which package is better at extracting resources from the environment. There's an
Right.
ecological component,
Right.
Yeah.
because that is so. In the Turkana case, their normative package does require men to take some pretty big risks, that can seem like, not really something that you'd want to buy into. But I think it has persisted because it has allowed them to get these ecological benefits. They're able to displace other groups from very scarce dry season pastures and occupy those areas.
Mm.
And as a result, kind of start spreading um, their the area of land that they can call Turkana, and also just get access to an extremely valuable resource in the dry season, which is going to literally be a huge determinant of population growth. Um, right? If you don't get pastures in the dry season, your animals are dying. And
Mm.
so, yeah, I think there's the alignment with the psychology part. That's one, in many places, that's why a normative package might work. But also there's the part about who's better at extracting
Mm.
which package is allowing you to extract more resources from the ecology, or be more competitive in intergroup
Right.
contest, or attract more people into your cultural group, etc. And all of those factors, I think, can play a role in why a normative package becomes, what it is,
Mm.
or stays.
Fascinating. I mean, so what you're suggesting to me, or what I'm hearing, is a really intriguing hypothesis about the origins of tribalism. So Dave and I are both interested in the human propensity to create groups and to have conflict with the outgroup. In some cases, aggress against the outgroup, dominate the outgroup. This is a huge part of the human condition. What you're suggesting is that this tendency toward tribalism, for lack of a better word, may in fact be a cultural adaptation rather than a genetic adaptation. That is, normative packages that extract more resources from the environment and extract more resources from other normative packages will by definition spread and proliferate. And that could very well be the normative package of protecting and defending everyone who shares that normative package and aggressing against and dominating and exploiting anyone who doesn't share that normative package. And so the possibility is that intergroup animosity, tribalism, there are lots of words for these things. We're all familiar with them. This could be a cultural adaptation, and that cultures that have these properties will, by definition, displace other cultures that lack these properties and will grow over time and will, in some cases, scale up as the group expands. As the normative package expands, the pool of cooperation and mutual protection and defense will expand, and you get larger and larger normative packages. And with larger and larger normative packages comes competition with other larger and larger normative packages, which creates more and more scaling, and you get larger and larger groups of collaborating humans. Number one, am I getting this view correct? And number two, are you in fact making that argument that the origins of intergroup animosity, tribalism, are better viewed as a cultural adaptation than a genetic adaptation?
Yeah, so I think your description of this process was nicely done, better than I can visualize it. So I appreciated that. So whether it is cultural or genetic, I think that there's definitely a big cultural part to it, but whether it's happening completely in the absence of any psychological bias towards a ethnic psychology or an in-group psychology or a tribal psychology, I think that's more of an open question because it is possible. So for instance, one way in which that could happen is simply that if cultural group selection like processes have been happening for a long period of our evolutionary history, then you should be getting a prepared psychology that is expecting something like that. And so you can get the kind of gene culture co-evolution of a genetically specified tribal psychology. But I think we don't, I am, while I say that that is theoretically possible, I just think that it remains empirically an open question. And I'm not yet willing to kind of, take sides on that. So, for example, I think this is now a paper that Matt Zefferman and I wrote on warfare and how group structured cultural selection can explain human warfare. We argued about how potentially one could separate the component that is coming from the genetic psychology by thinking about, for instance, is it easier to get norms that make people want to defend their group? Right. So like we're talking that there are normative packages that work and that are spreading. But is that normative package that is calling people to kind of favor their in-group and compete against the out-group, is that normative package partly also doing very well because we also have a psychology that's telling us that, we should expect norms like this to exist in the world that we are born to, and we should be ready to learn those norms? Or is that norm just like any other norm that kind of can come about? Are we just as likely to learn a norm about group defense as we are to learn a norm about, how to use a computer properly? Right? So that would be maybe a good experiment that can look at, are we going back to where Dave starred in this great movie on prepared social learning in that paper? It would be really nice if we could do an experiment that looked at the extent to which we are prepared to learn norms that have to do with in-group, with a tribal psychology or a, intergroup competitive psychology, or are all norms, many norms kind of equally learnable if we get the same inputs to them? Does that make sense, Dave?
Yeah, and I mean, and also, and I also just want to say it's really interesting and really complicated. I want to clarify something too, which is that obviously when we say is it cultural genetic, we're not saying that there isn't, as Sarah already said, a bunch of the evolved psychology in people that's constantly evaluating and enabling these norms to continue. It's just
Yep.
sort of what's tipping the scale, right? It's
Yep.
the question of sort of what's necessary, or why are we getting, what's the lever, what's the thing that kind of flips the switch, and is it better explained by culture, the content of what's of the norm versus in the rule, right? Like, so sort of like, let's say I'm an American right after 2001 and I go bomb Afghanistan, right? Like, is that because of my evolved psychology, or is it because I'm in an institutional structure where somebody told me you got to go do this, and if I don't do it,
Yeah.
I don't get paid, like that, right? Like,
Right.
and so obviously there's an evolved psychology of lots of things, but then there's a question of sort of what is that institution? What's the cultural institution too? I don't know if that's helpful or clarifying. I just want to say one other quick thing, which is that even if there is an evolved psychology for expecting to be in these situations, to the extent it is naturally selected, it's also going to be sort of like, okay, I'm a male who's being told to go possibly die for some person in power. There's going to be really strong selection process on being like, is that a good idea, right? Or like, what are the
Right.
cues that that's a good idea? And then you would expect
Right.
cultural institutions to sort of hijack the ones that work, right? Hijack the cues that make it seem like it's a good idea. Like, oh, our probability of success is very high. So let's have lots of parades where I'm just surrounded by incredible amounts of power. So I feel like, well, of course, it's a
Yes.
good idea for me to go do this because, of course, we're going to win, right? Like, so that's just
Right.
one other example, too, where um, even if there is evolved design, it might not be as simple as there's a bias to go do it. It might just be that there's evolved design to sort of evaluate it in a really smart way. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess that's also that layer that I was talking about of, yeah, do we come more ready to acquire social norms that are in particular domains,
Right.
and
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
the
exactly. Yeah.
direction? So, like, for instance, if the norm says, don't fight with these people, is that norm easier or harder to learn than a norm that says you can fight with these people? Right?
Right.
Hmm.
Like,
Yeah.
or a norm
Yeah.
about getting something arbitrary that's unrelated to
Yeah.
these group level competitive processes. So that's maybe the middle layer, which I thought,
Yeah.
like, is a good space to explore, because I really haven't seen any
Hmm.
studies about um, that aspect. It's either like, okay, are we kind of biased towards tribal psychology, or is it just the norm, but not, is there, are we biased
Hmm.
towards learning a norm that will tell us to do X over a norm
Yeah.
that tells us to do Y?
Yeah. That's
So
a really great, I love that. Yeah. Like, it's what's
Yeah.
sticky. That's a great question. Yeah. That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that in so many intergroup conflicts, the outgroup is demonized as being antisocial or exploitative or dangerous, right? Or, dirty, whatever. We have this rich psychology of partner choice where we're evaluating with whom we should cooperate. And when we look at the narratives that are engineered about the outgroup, you just go down the list of everything that is bad in a social partner the outgroup has, right? Uh, and that can't be a coincidence. I mean, so if it were purely, it almost speaks to in favor of the cultural view, where if we had a genetic disposition to aggress against outgroups, we wouldn't need those narratives, right? They're in the outgroup. Let's just kill them and dominate them and exploit them. It doesn't matter how good maybe even if they're better than us, that's a better reason for us to attack them, right? So
Yeah.
it shouldn't matter. We shouldn't need those narratives if it's a purely genetic disposition to attack outgroups, right? But if it's a cultural evolutionary package that harnesses aspects of our evolved psychology in service of intergroup competition, then you would expect that cultural package to harness pre-existing features of the psychology that allow hatred,
Hmm.
aggression, anger-based bargaining, etc. And so what it's doing is it's harnessing aspects of our partner choice psychology in service of intergroup competition, because the only groups that would have been successful in coordinating outgroup aggression were the groups that had normative packages and narratives that demonized the outgroup in whatever way was
Mm.
possible. I don't know. That's just a thought that's occurring to me right now. I'm curious what you think.
So that kind of just made me remember about a very recent paper that Matt Zefferman and I are working on, a chapter that will come up in this edited volume on essentialism
Mm.
that Christina Moya had invited us to contribute to. We looked at the attitudes that the Turkana have towards the Toposa, the group that they are engaged in very lethal conflict with, and
Mhm.
most Turkana know somebody who's been killed by a Toposa. Most Turkana, especially in the border area, know somebody or have personally had their animals taken in a raid and stuff like that. So you'd think that this is a place where maybe this kind of dehumanizing kind of framework should get mobilized. And then when they talk about, going to raid the Toposa, they gather together and they talk about, revenge and like we need to retaliate because they came and they took our stuff. So it's like building up that anger,
Mhm.
etc. But really, really interesting. We did the switched at birth task
Mhm.
for the Turkana and Toposa. So if a Toposa baby is raised by the Turkana, spend all their life in the Turkana, would the baby be Toposa or Turkana, and vice versa? If a
Mhm.
Turkana baby was adopted by the Toposa and grew up there, would it be Turkana or Toposa? And can I ask you to guess what you think people would have said?
People are not
Mm.
essentialistic.
I guess I gave it away, but
No, but this was actually
That-
because this was my reading
yeah.
of the literature, though, which is
Yeah.
sort of that. Well, no, I'll let you. Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I was personally surprised just at how low it was. I knew it wouldn't be potentially that high, but we had only about 2% of our subjects give the essentialist response. That was like 4 subjects.
So give the response that a Turkana is still a Turkana if they're raised by the opposite group,
Exactly.
and vice versa. So
Yeah.
they're thinking that if you're raised in that group, you're a member of that group.
Yeah.
That's who you are.
And if a
Yeah.
Toposa baby is raised by us, that baby is a Turkana and not a Toposa.
Hmm.
And so we kind of delved a little bit into the literature on ethnic essentializing beliefs, and it does. Some people have argued that it's those beliefs that can allow you to more easily dehumanize the out group because they're different from you. They don't have the same things you have, the essence that you have, and the prejudice, hostilities, and dehumanization kind of is more easy in that context. But yeah, we see literally like no. Yeah, I would say, close to zero essentializing beliefs.
It's a fascinating result. Yeah.
Yeah. And this was part of the study we did on post-traumatic stress disorder in Turkana warriors with Matt Zefferman.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that to make sure we get to that. That's fantastic. Yeah, but please, yeah, yeah.
Because actually, I think that study also relates a little bit to your question about, how the genetic psychology versus norms are playing into warfare, etc. So, just stepping back a little bit on that question, because the Turkana are exposed to these really high rates of lethal violence and raids, it's a very important context in which you can ask that question: are warriors having combat-related PTSD? And going into this project, I had literally like zero idea of what we will find. I would not have been surprised either
Yeah.
which way. But purely because in like the many, many interviews that I had done with people, and when people recounted raids that were fairly traumatic, etc., nobody ever mentioned anything about, having intrusive thoughts afterwards or anything. I mean, I didn't specifically query about it, but it never like spontaneously came up in any kind of thing. And so that empirical impression was that maybe this is not a thing here. But then theoretically, Matt Zepperman and I were kind of putting on our hats as well-informed evolutionary behavioral sciences researchers and thinking, what does everything we know about human evolution tell us that we should find here? And we made predictions that basically integrate kind of like these evolved psychological dispositions with the norm psychology. So what we said was that, well, if PTSD is about learning to respond to physical danger and protect yourself from that, then that is a universal threat. And that, all human populations should have evolved, should have the psychology, the evolved psychology to protect yourself from that kind of situation. And if you look at the PTSD symptoms, there are 20 of them, but only a few of them actually align with that kind of response. So those are called the learning and reacting. We call them the learning and reacting symptoms, and these are the symptoms of hypervigilance, startle, so that essentially acute distress. So like, everything's, your body is getting pumped up to deal with this risk, and an intrusive thought. So you're like learning about it and thinking about it even after the event, so that you can kind of seal it in your head that when this happens, what I do. So we basically predicted that learning and reacting symptoms make a lot of sense cross-culturally, universally. Humans should evolve a psychology that makes them react in this way to physical danger. So in that sense, the Turkana should have that. But there are other symptoms of PTSD that are a little bit more unusual. And one group of symptoms are more overlapping with like depressive symptoms. So they make people feel, you feel estranged, and you don't feel like interacting with others. It's like a negative mood. And these seem more about affecting people's motivation, right, to engage in that. Now, I know there are many theories of depression, including from, evolutionary psychologists like, I think, Ed Hagen.
Yeah, we had him on.
Bargaining.
Yeah, exactly. But essentially, one way to think about this, and that does overlap with what's been said in the literature, is that depressive symptoms change your motivation to engage in that thing. And so that's kind of the framework we adopted, is saying that, so there's another class of symptoms that's affecting your motivation. And we kind of conjectured that those symptoms are going to be something that that plays more, that is influenced also not just by the physical risks of going to war, but the normative landscape, that is the social rewards and social costs of these actions. And the reason why we felt that is because, if you think about humans, one of the really tricky things about war is that it's making people do something in some ways that's very unusual, right? Like, by and large, people are told, you can't harm this person, you can't kill this person. You kill somebody, even in rage, accident, you can be ostracized from your society, the rest of your life's over. It's like this really heavy and loaded thing in a huge normative context. But then there's this kind of normative context where it says, if these conditions are met, then this is okay to do. And the thing is that in many war contexts, those norms are really it's a fine line. Like, if you look at clan warfare, for instance, there are rules about, how much damage you can inflict on this other clan, and like what kind of weapons you can use, and like how you need to compensate. So it's still structured in a normative landscape in many, many societies, like the violence that is allowed, the extent to which it's allowed, and exactly who it can be targeted to, whether it can be targeted towards women and children. What should you do when, somebody's unarmed? Can you take them? Can you ambush people when they're not ready for a battle? And all those kinds of things.
Mhm.
To what extent can you destroy their property in the course of the war? And in different societies at different scales, you can have different norms. Like, okay, if it's another clan in your same ethnic group, maybe there is like more of a ceremonial kind of warfare where we're not inflicting too much damage. But if we go a little further away towards these other people, we can go all out, etc. So that
Mhm.
moral landscape is a kind of like walking through a moral landmine in some ways. Like there is a way to walk and do it right, but there's also many ways in which you can do it wrong. And so we predicted that, humans, if combat related PTSD has evolved to deal with human warfare, then it's going to have to deal with these kind of normative dangers, the moral risks, because the conditions for war in humans are very much specified by the specific norms. And so we kind of predicted that it's these moral violations, either as victims of violation or as perpetrators of violations, that should be more strongly associated with the depressive symptoms. And we found that in the Turkana, that is the case. Now, the first thing we found is that first, a third of the warriors in our sample did have sufficient symptom severity that would qualify them for a provisional PTSD diagnosis here in the West. Some of them were describing symptoms that you wouldn't be able to tell apart if it was a Turkana or an American soldier, talking about like the hypervigilance, like and startle and things like that. There was
Mhm.
one person who talked about how he just heard a sound put at night and just woke up, took his gun and fired, and he shot a donkey that was just walking,
Wow.
right?
Wow.
So so there's a lot of cultural parallels, which does speak to this kind of like a universal evolved psychology for this kind of physical danger response. Because the really interesting thing about the Turkana is that they don't have a concept of this set of symptoms. They don't have a name for this condition
Mhm.
of what that embodies these set of symptoms. So it's not that because they know it, they match this thing with that cultural framework. When we ask people, we're like, a lot of people would talk about these symptoms, but they were like, yeah, I told my friend, and my friend was like, just forget about it. Just don't think about it. Like, yeah, there wasn't like a thing that people identified, oh, you're suffering from this, and this is how we deal with the startle, hypervigilance or startle. So I think that's a very powerful indication that there's something underlying in the psychology in which you can get such strong convergence between two populations that are experiencing very different kinds of warfare. One which is like so familiar with the concept, one which is not, but get them to literally be saying the same thing.
Yeah.
So I thought that was a very interesting aspect of this work that struck me. But when it came to the depressive symptoms, we found that the Turkana do have that too. Um, uh, but when we compared it to the Western sample, we found that the US, for any particular symptom severity, the US soldiers had more of those depressive symptoms compared to like the Turkana warriors. So there's more of a cultural difference between these populations on that front than there is on the physical danger response front.
Hmm.
And our hypothesis was that this has to do with exposure to moral violations, and we found that within the Turkana, people who had reported more exposure to like moral violations and social sanctions as a result of their participation had more depressive symptoms than those
Hmm.
who didn't. So at least within the group, we kind of found some support for that. But we haven't yet done that with the US sample. But one of my graduate students, Michael Baumgarten, who's a retired Army Ranger, is for his dissertation work doing a project with the US veterans to kind of test this moral injury, whether exposure to moral violations specifically has an effect on depressive symptoms and not on the other kinds of symptoms. So I think that work provides some support for this idea that our war psychology is one that is prepared to anticipate moral risks and
Mm,
be vigilant about, the normative landscape,
right.
right? And so at least that it has evolved in a space in which norms played a big role in shaping how we deal with these dangerous war related situations, physically dangerous and morally dangerous because of the normative landscape in which it's happening. So I wonder, it's not directly speaking to the question that David, you asked, but it is I think, indirectly getting at the fact that, yes, we do have genetically evolved psychology that is making us vigilant a norm, to the normative complexity in war. And that means that norms have been an important part of the EEA in which warfare evolved, right? And or an important part of the psychology that has shaped our motivations. And
Interesting. That, yeah. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I have, so many questions, but I mean, to me, I think that is supportive of this cultural view of warfare, because if we had a genetic psychological disposition toward outgroup aggression, we wouldn't need this convoluted
Yeah, we'd be
package of
robots.
norms.
We'd be like, push
Yeah,
the war button. Good.
yeah.
I'm
Push the war
good.
button. Let's kill the outgroup
Yeah.
members. Who cares? And about but precisely because we need this rich set of norms about when to attack, how we attack, who is worth attacking, who is not, why they're attacking, what the harm they've done to us. We need these elaborate rituals where we get together and dance and feel formidable, like this huge convoluted package of cultural stuff. You would not need it if it was a purely a genetically evolved system. If it was purely genetic adaptation for warfare, right? The elaborateness of the cultural stuff here that is driving warfare speaks to adaptation more at the cultural level than at the biological level. At least to me, that's what I'm taking from this.
I think
Uh,
it
you
speaks
know,
to that kind of more middle intricate part where it's
you
saying
know,
that, so yes, war in humans is being made possible by norms.
yeah,
But because of a long history of that having played out, we are also having a genetically evolved psychology to be prepared to be vigilant of when we are committing norm violations. Um,
hmm
and be prepared to like lose our motivation to engage in this action if we perceive that we're not getting the social rewards that we anticipated, because I mean it's a big deal to go and like put your life on the line and then not
yeah,
get the social rewards, right? So
right,
it I feel like it kind of is
Mm,
getting at that sandwiched layer that I keep kind of coming back to, where like,
yeah.
yes, the norms are I think, the driving force, but because of a long history of that, we have genetically evolved psychological mechanisms that anticipates there to be norms related to how you handle killing of outgroup members and be extra vigilant when you are in
yeah.
that context and respond appropriately by withdrawing. And we don't, I would predict that we might not find that kind of hypervigilance to moral violations in other contexts that are more evolutionarily novel, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Maybe.
So yeah. So
Yeah.
I have a question about, you mentioned that among the Turkana who did show symptoms of depression associated with their PTSD, that those were the Turkana that experienced social sanctions or disapproval from their group mates about the violence. So I'm curious about what those social sanctions consisted in. Was it sanctions about the participation in the violence itself for being, say, cruel or something like that? Or was it more about cowardice and not being cruel enough?
Yeah, so it was actually a huge package. So we kind of lumped together all the kind of moral events, violations as either victims or perpetrators. So that, part of the reason for doing that is because that's how it's done in the moral injury literature in the West. But also it's because sometimes if you ask people directly about perpetration, they might feel more resistant to like disclosing it. So the questions are a little bit phrased like, were you involved in or witnessed, something like this? And so we cannot necessarily tease apart whether they were involved in so there's a little ambiguity about how they were involved in that moral violation. But for some of the questions. But the kinds of moral violations span a range. Some is that, you took your friend, you made your friend come with you on the raid, and you came back and friend died in the raid. You go tell their parents that this is what happened, and you will literally face, like, they will blame you
Wow.
for having taken their son and come back without him. There are people who've had to, when somebody gets injured on the battlefield, they are sometimes 50 kilometers. They have to run back 50 kilometers, right? So if somebody is injured, they can't necessarily always transport that person back. They would have to carry that person and hide, or still kind of slowly trudge back. So many times they make like painful decisions about having to like abandon somebody, even a friend. A group of people will say, no, we can't do this, and they'll like hide this person in a bush or so, hope that he doesn't get seen by the enemies, but eventually can like slowly make his way back home. But many of the times these people die. There are times where people run out of water, and they couldn't share water with they uh, maybe they couldn't share their bullets or share their water with somebody who needed it because they didn't have. So there's many instances like that. There's also instances of people feeling let down by like the diviner, for instance, so some raids are organized by diviners who say like they had a vision that if you go to this place and if you do X, Y, and Z rituals along the way, that we are going to have a good outcome. And they do all of that, and then things go catastrophically wrong. People get killed, they're ambushed, the enemy knew that they were coming, whatever, and then they feel like they were lied to by the leader. In that way, the diviner doesn't, it's not like he's a general, he doesn't go on the raid, he just is a prophet who has
So
a
he has no skin in the game from a game theory perspective. Yeah.
it's an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah.
And there are instances where people have come across like young kids who are uh, unarmed, but sometimes they get killed. Some people think it's okay to kill a kid that's unarmed. Some people might think it's not. Um, uh, and so they might be exposed to somebody kind of like kidnapping a kid or shooting a kid, even though they personally think that that shouldn't have been done, etc. So there's a whole range of moral violations that kind of end up in the picture that we haven't been able to tease apart, like which kind of yields this. That we don't have that level of fine grainness, but we know that as a package, the people who have had more moral violation related issues have more of have more depressive symptoms. And it could also be cowardice, people being accused of having done something, but they might feel like, well, I actually was in the wrong place, like I was getting fired at, you didn't see, or I was out of bullets, etc., and being blamed for that, etc. So it is, we don't have the kind of data that could tease apart exactly which types of moral violations lead to, more or less symptoms.
Can I ask a clarification question? David's question, and I was thinking along the same lines, is that there were cues that the people back at home were displeased. And obviously, like some of the stories are like you killed my son because you invited him. So obviously that happens. But I'm wondering, like in some of these other cases, like where if I'm on the raid and I don't, and like the people I'm with, like just kill this kid.
Mhm.
Um, like that's a situation where like I'm evaluating that as like, this is a really horrible thing. I feel really bad about this. I feel like, I mean, this is not maybe conscious or maybe, people are going to think really badly of me, but that may not happen in the sense of I'm designed to not even talk about that because exactly I'm worried about like the social consequences of people knowing that. Um, so did, were you able to look at sort of, or I'm just sort of wondering, like and I don't want to hem and haw too much, but I'm wondering sort of like the design in each of the people who was feeling depressed is probably to sort of like keep this information away from people,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Do you see what I'm getting? So I'm kind of wondering like how much of it is sort of anticipating
Mhm.
that I'm going to be socially sanctioned. And actually, as a consequence of that, not actually presenting the information. So you don't necessarily get cues, but you're sort of imagining that you'll be socially sanctioned. But then in other situations, you are socially sanctioned. Are both things happening or?
Probably, if I understand you correctly, the first part will result in an underreporting of
Yeah.
moral events.
Well, maybe not necessarily, but just a thing of, I'm actually thinking like, number one, what's the cue structure of I've committed a moral offense? Right? Which is sort of, you can imagine a situation where it's sort of like I don't think this is true, but you can imagine a design of the human psychology where it's like the warfare button has been pressed. This is all awesome. We're doing all these horrible things, but we're in war mode, so it's all fine. But then we get back to the village, and then whatever people hear, we just sort of, whenever somebody says, "Oh, that's actually bad," we're like, "Oh no, now we did something wrong," and we're just going to use like the social reaction of the community as our or sort of moral compass. But there's another version where there's already sort of an internalization, or even an anticipation of sort of like what I think people will react to, and consequently you don't even need to get the reaction
Uh-huh.
from
Yeah.
people. Yeah.
So I think that actually, yeah, I think there's both going on because that actually brings me to something that I really should have said. One of the things that we looked at is whether people have killed an enemy in combat,
Mm.
right? And very interestingly, this is definitely went against my prediction. I would have predicted that that would not be a source of a moral violation in the Turkana context because they have a lot of cultural institutions to actually like reward warriors who have killed in combat. They get to scar themselves in a particular way that permanently marks them as like, a warrior and be proud of it. Um, and but in the US, we know that there is an association between having killed in combat and having more higher severity of mental health issues. But interestingly, we found that even though it's highly rewarded, people who had killed in combat were more likely to have depressive symptoms, had higher depressive symptom severity than those who hadn't. So killing was one of
Wow.
our moral, this thing, we kept it separate because it's such a salient category.
Mm.
But it essentially, so then we probed that a little further. And there is a researcher who works on the Samburu Belinda Strait who has done a lot of work also on the kinds of emotions that of haunting that people feel, that Samburu warriors feel when they've killed in
Mm.
combat. And we found a lot of analogs of that in the Turkana, analogs of what she had described in the Samburu, which is that people, even though this is so culturally rewarded, there is people report often feeling haunted by the ghost of the enemy. And that is an intrusive thing. It keeps coming back. They can't get it out of them. And
Mm.
they have to do cleansing ceremonies in order to like kind of help them alleviate that psychological distress in some ways. Um, and I think that maybe gets at this fact that killing is just such a salient kind of moral violation, and it might have it might be really hard to override it, even with these cultural signals of this, because the main reason is that killing can't be compensated in some ways, right? Like, I mean, cultures have come up with ways of compensating and making up for having done that wrong. Like, you compensate the family, but there's no like, you really can't compensate the individual that has been killed. It's a very stark kind of moral violation in that way. Whereas other moral violations, I think, are, okay, you screwed up, but you have a chance to kind of rectify that and do differently, do better, signal that you are remorseful, by maybe having these depressive symptoms, etc. But killing does seem to be special in that sense, and I think that's interesting because it both gets at something that can't be overridden by by the cultural institutions, but also that I think that's an indication of maybe how morally treacherous killing is, even in the context of warfare, right?
Yeah.
Like we come very prepared to be very hyper vigilant about engaging in that um, in the context of war, even because, yeah, like the truth is that today people might have said it's okay to have killed this person, but tomorrow they'll say, oh, you did that, like, no, we should not be doing that, we should not be killing these people, they're one of us, or those were not acceptable conditions for having killed, etc. And there's nothing you can do. The person's gone. There's no reparation that
Yeah.
can be made.
Wow. I mean, that's truly fascinating and sobering stuff. Um, I, I mean, I don't know if there's that much left to say. Do you have any other questions about this, Dave?
I was gonna say, hopefully this is, well, I mean, it's a good and bad thing, but like just swinging back to AI and robots, this is like they're building now. This is why there's going to be robots that are doing the killing, right? But
Yeah.
maybe the robots will just start killing the other robots, and it'll just be robot attrition, and nobody needs to die in war. So
Yeah. I mean, again, this also speaks to me that a lot of the psychology of warfare and intergroup violence and intergroup hostility is a kind of cultural technology to overcome aspects of our psychology that would otherwise be compelled against it. That we have these powerful drives to not kill, to not be cruel, and it takes a lot of cultural machinery to overcome that. And it may be that, in the United States, our cultural machinery is not as good or as well adapted, and that might explain why we have higher prevalence of depressive symptoms among our soldiers. Whereas in the Turkana, their cultural machinery might be a little more well adapted, which allows them to overcome some of that depression, but clearly not all of it, because it still exists to a significant degree. And it just speaks to how difficult a challenge it is to knit together these groups of, reputation conscious, status conscious, self-interested humans and knit them together into cooperative groups that can compete with other groups. And there are a lot of barriers to overcome in that knitting problem. And cultures can evolve over time to solve it, but there's only so much that can be solved.
yeah, and I think I want to just swing it back too to like the almost the ASU interdisciplinarity part too is
Yeah.
like Europe, for example, it was full of violence forever. I mean, if you watch like these YouTube animations of like, or any area, like, China or anything, it's just like, oh my God, so many people dying. The colors on the map keep changing, and then and then there's a change at some point in, and so like the idea that sort of, the groups that succeed are the ones that are extracting resources for the people in the groups, right? But you can sort of change the rules. People can change the rules sometimes. So something like the EU, right, where all of a sudden it's no longer there's big costs now to fighting,
Mhm.
to the point where if I'm like a French farmer, it's actually better that I'm not shooting at the Germans across the Rhine because actually I'm getting, the food from them, and like it doesn't help me at all. Because and so somebody sort of or a group of people, a big enough group of people sort of decided maybe we can change sort of what's the selection dynamic of the institution in a different way. And I think that um, I hope my hope would be that something like I think there's always this golden $1 million, which is now ridiculous because we're in America where $1 million like buys you, I don't know, a mobile home or something in Santa Barbara, I don't know, but like the $1 billion question, the trillions of dollar question is sort of how do you reduce war, and with the like PTSD, the cultural selection is all sort of on the front end in America, right? It's not like we're not selecting institutions that sort of like help people not go to war. It's sort of so I think in this ASU way, if I'm sort of not being super clear, but I think the idea would be if we can be mindful or better understand the cultural selection of why belligerence happens, for example, like in the Turkana, then there may be ways of thinking about, well, might there be ways to sort of what are the on the ground ways to make it in more people's interest to not shoot across the river anymore? It's a hard question, but I think like this is starting to get at the tools to do that. And something like the ASU thing, I mean, you can't, that's a lot of social engineering and there can be unintended consequences and you have to be really careful about that stuff. But I don't know. I think the more we understand why people might be doing this thing and the benefits they're getting, then maybe we can think about ways to maybe make the benefit structure and the environment a bit different.
That is the optimistic view.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would hope there's some room for that. And we know historically institutions have emerged between like, huge units like nations. And yeah, like you have things like the EU that have norms of war and things like that. But yeah, it seems like one of the harder problems to solve. It does happen. So humans have occasionally found these pathways, but they have also often not found these pathways. And so whether the glass is half full, half empty, that's based on whether you live in Santa Barbara and you look over the ocean or into the dry desert.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, this time absolutely flew by. This was such
Yeah.
a fascinating conversation. My mind is still spinning. Um,
Yeah,
but it's
Sarah.
time for us
I
to ask
thought
the
like 2 hours would be like so long. I mean,
Yeah, no, it just goes like that. Yeah.
yeah, it really
Yeah,
flies
no,
by.
Sarah, yeah, no, thank you so much. We will have to have you back on because I mean, we really just skimmed the surface, but really fascinating, really important work. Thank you so much for doing it. This stuff with the all of the work that you've done in with the Turkana and both theoretical work and empirical work. It's so it's such a I don't even know. It's sort of silly to even give it an adjective, but it's just such wonderful, strong. I feel like your work is one of the great pillars of like our generation of evolutionary sciences. So thank you for doing it. It's just fascinating and it's so interesting and it's such an important thing about war and violence and killing. What could be more important than that? And so it's not a and as always, I mean, David and I always joke, like, whenever we have an anthropologist on, like, we should be saying thank you for your service, right? Like, it's a very
Yeah.
difficult and dangerous, thing to do. So thank you for doing it.
Yep.
It's been one of the most fulfilling aspects of my academic life has been to like get to see a different culture and get, kind of see the world through like a different cultural lens. I think it's actually really worth it.
Mm.
Hard
Yeah.
as it
Yeah.
is, it's totally worth it.
Yeah, so I love my ending thing is here. Norms are selfish, and I love that. That's like that will stick with me for following norms is
Really.
selfish, but that's maybe good. So
Yeah,
it's a
totally.
really complicated and sophisticated, mature way to think. I think about the world.
Yeah, it was a wonderful, yeah, that's another thing that stuck with me is a wonderful perspective shift on the psychology of fairness and egalitarianism, that we commonly have a very sunny and idealistic view of these things, but in reality, they're just mechanisms for ensuring that everyone's self-interest is being enhanced, right?
Coordinated. Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
Yeah.
So that everybody's happy, so that people don't blow up the whole deal. We got to
Yep.
make sure that everyone's happy, and that's just what fairness is, right?
Um,
Yeah. So it's a wonderful perspective shift. And this is a really great conversation. So thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm not sure the philosophers would like that take, but
Yeah.
Well, the
that
philosophers are there's going to be there's going to be a lot of philosophers unhappy about a lot of science for the next 1,000 years. So, all
Yeah.
right. Thank you, Sarah.
Well, you're still here listening, which means we must be doing something right if you're listening.
Yeah, or
Um,
we're some of us are doing something right enough.
yeah, or maybe you just forgot to turn us off
Yeah.
and we're just
Just
talking,
keep sleeping. Just
to
keep
no one.
sleeping.
Yeah,
Sleep,
go back
sleep
to
is
sleep.
so important. It's so hard to get in this day. And if you're driving and sleeping, wake up.
Yes, because we wouldn't want you to get into an
Yeah.
accident. That would be bad.
I might have
All
just
right.
saved I might have just saved somebody's life for all we know.
Yeah, that's true. And if you want us to save more lives by putting us in more people's ears,
Good.
you can spread the good word, support us on Patreon, write us a kind review, say nice things about us on social media, and reach out to us. Send us an email if you have ideas for episodes, possible guests. We are open to suggestions.
I love the idea of a review that whose title isn't "Might Save Your Life." ...
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Mm,
That's what we're doing here. We're saving lives,
that's
one podcast episode at a
wow.
time.
Okay. On that note, see you next week, everybody. Okay.